Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being there online. We have gone through in our presentation of these webinars a series on the business plan. The first one we had about a year back or so was actually on the importance of a business plan, where we discussed about what exactly is a business plan, why is it important, why is a business plan required in the very first place, who needs a business plan, what are the types of business plan that are involved, and what is the contents of a business plan. In a subsequent webinar, which was held a couple of months back, we discussed about what are the essential components of the business plan that need to be highlighted, where we really looked at what exactly is the market for your product, then what should your USP, unique selling proposition, should be, and then funding needs and cash flow estimates of your project, and evaluation. How do you evaluate a business plan financially in terms of feasibility, etc. And then the key people who can make your business plan a success. That's what we have seen. Going forward, we would like to pick up each one of these essential components and go a little more in depth into it. Today, I will be looking at the funding needs and the cash flow estimates of the business plan. So let us discuss the important components of what is the funding need and what is the cash flow needs of the business plan. How is it differentiate? How do you differentiate the two? You really look at, when you look at a project, I'm referring to mostly a small scale industry that is going into manufacturing. Let's say a component manufacturing industry. So we'll work around this kind of an example. So when you talk of a project cost, you literally look at the funds that are required to set up the factory or set up the industry or set up the business. When you talk about cash flow needs, you're really looking at cash flow needs to keep running the company for it to take off. So while we talk of a project finance or project funding, you're looking at long-term sources of funds. And when you look at cash flow needs, you're invariably talking of short-term working capital needs. Maybe sometimes the long-term may be involved depending on how you structure it. So that's how we differentiate between project funding and cash flow, the cash flow needs of a particular project. So when you say project funding needs, so again, how do you estimate the actually total capital required? When you say a particular project, and traditionally when people talk about a project, then there are basically three components that go into it. The first one is fixed assets. When you talk of a project funding, what we really talk of is how do you estimate a project cost? What are the constituents of a project cost? Basically, you can look into three components. One is the fixed assets, which are the assets that go into help you into produce and help you into convert whatever raw material into finished product. You have something called pre-operative expenses. These are expenses you need to incur in order for the industry or a factory or a business to take off. And the third component is working capital needs. Now, you need a certain set of working capital so that you can smoothly continue to operate. Now, these are a prerequisite for you to kind of set up, and you need to estimate these requirements very clearly so that you know what exactly are the funding needs. And how do you finance it is a question of debt equity, which is a standard thing people talk about. And usually people use 2:1 debt equity ratio to estimate the loan capital and the equity capital. And there's a formula like normally people estimate, 2 months working capital, 3 months working capital. Now, these two, I don't directly subscribe to it because I think you need to really determine what exactly is the correct debt equity ratio. And what is that, how much you can really be able to borrow. And working capital, how much really do you need? So let us go into each one of these and see what it constitutes. Whether you overestimate or you underestimate on the project cost has both cost implications as well as the project success. Because either you underestimate, you run out of funds and you're stuck, and you may end up borrowing very heavily or at a high cost if you don't estimate correctly. If you overestimate also, then your project cost, then your borrowing cost can go up. So you really look at, that is the necessity for estimating the actual funding needs of the for a particular project. So the first of the components, let us look at fixed assets. What constitutes a fixed assets in a typical project? You know, you are aware that the land, the building, the plant and machinery, the utilities, which are basically your support services like your genset and your power or a boiler, some of the utilities. These constitute really your fixed assets, which form the bulk of your capital expenditure, which is for the project. The land and the building, you have two options. Instead of taking up a land and building a factory, you could look at an industrial estate where you could lease it or rent it instead of buying. So thereby, you don't require the immediate capital down payment that is required for this sort of a thing. You could do it more on a rental basis. The other aspect about land also, suppose you are setting up in a certain backward area or a notified backward area, you could also get some incentives from the government, thereby some cash incentives can come in there. So, or alternatively, if a small equity of let's say 5% or 10% of the equity, the Industrial Development Authority or some of the government agencies can contribute towards the equity as a land towards the land cost. So this way your own personal outlay can be reduced. So when you look at the plant and machinery, there are various options really. This becomes a chunk of your investment. When you look at plant and machinery, you have different ways of financing it. Of course, one of the standard ways would be you go to the bank, take a term loan, and this term loan finances this kind of plant and machinery, and then you pay over a period. The moratorium on this kind of a term loan, it should be equivalent to the time you start generating revenue. Only then you will be able to meet the cash flow. In fact, the moratorium can be little more than that because you have start generating surplus in order to pay back the banks. Definitely, other than the bank term loan, the two other options we could be looking at is deferred payment scheme from option, the supplier finance. How does this come about? If you really look at it, like especially capital goods, if your seller of capital goods is willing to arrange a buyer's finance, it is almost equivalent to a loan you're taking from a bank, but you're paying in a deferred payment basis. Thereby, you are not immediately committing yourself to plant and machinery cost, but you're paying over a period of 3 years or 5 years. This especially holds good if you're importing capital goods. The Exim banks of certain countries give definitely incentives for export of the capital goods. Our own Exim Bank in India does that too. So through which you could get a kind of a deferred payment scheme at a very attractive concessional finance rate. So look at that option. The second option, how you can reduce plant and machinery, of course, using used plant and machinery. This is a technical challenge. You should really be able to, you have a good control over technology or the technical aspect of it, thereby so that you know exactly how to reuse these kind of machinery or recondition. There are number of projects which have been closed down for either lack of management skill, lack of finance, or being in a wrong place. If you are in a position, and there are a number of ways to identify that, if you're in a position to identify these kind of plant and machinery, then at a fraction of the original cost, you should be able to get these assets off and either recondition them and bring them over and set it up. The challenge lies in making sure these machinery work to the expectation and the logistics involved in moving this plant and machinery. In both these schemes, you would also be able to substantially reduce the cost. I can give two examples straight away in both these schemes. We ourselves involved in Exim Bank finance of some capital goods, where we were able to get a very attractive financial interest rate for a loan of 2-year moratorium and 5-year repayment for a capital good at LIBOR plus basis. So that has helped tremendously in bringing down the project cost. And in case of used plant and machinery, we were also involved in another project where we were able to import a complete plant and dismantle it like Lego pieces, reassemble it in another location in Asia, and restart the factory. The process took a long time, like any other typical happens in the factory. But then in the end, we succeeded in setting up and restarting the plant after reconditioning some of the key parts, etc. But for that, we had excellent technical team and the logistics team. It's a challenge, but used plant and machinery is definitely a good source of reducing the project cost. Next question is the utilities. Utilities, two options that you have. Well, of course, buying outright is one option. But then if you want to reduce, you could look at lease option. Office equipment being a very small value, you don't have to, but if it is required, you could even try and lease. So what is the aim of all these things, to doing all these things? Basically, to reduce the initial cash outlay or project cost, then reduce so that thereby once your project outlay is reduced, your equity contribution also reduces, and then so that the lower capital outlay is there. The leasing is definitely a little more expensive, but then if it's something affordable where you have a good profit margin, and maybe it's much better option to look at. The second aspect, what we look at, is pre-operative expenses. These are things which you have to get involved in all these costs before really the business can take off. Like right from company formation, the initial market survey you may have to do, and then the feasibility report preparation, because you may have to employ a professional to get a feasibility report. Then developing a market channel, you may have to study the market or maybe go around establishing the market, getting market collateral. All these are operations before you start, are pre-operative expenses. These cannot be avoided. It has to be done to make sure that you are in the right direction, and any course correction required. These kind of surveys and studies will give you a certain amount of guidance for the course correction. Usually, many of the projects, they take 3% or 2% or some percentage as pre-operative. I wouldn't recommend that at all. I would like you to actually go into specific activities, identify specific activities, put a cost component to it, and then only determine pre-operative expenses. That will give more accurate picture. So it should not be, as I mentioned, should not be taken as a percentage of the cost. The third element, as we have seen, is actually the working capital needs. Now, to be determined is based on the cash flow projections. How much, like, what are you, once your units start production, what kind of a cash flows are you projecting? And what does the working capital actually constitute of? If you really look at it, it's the raw material, work in progress, the finished goods, all these constitute inventory, the payables and receivables, they form overall the working capital. And how do you determine this becomes also very important. And also important is how do you forecast the price movements? Your raw material, what does it depend on? Is it depend on any seasonality factors wherein you may have to pick it up and stock at when prices are low? Then you have to compare with cost of carrying inventory to procuring at a higher price. Some sort of a cost benefit analysis you need to do. WIP, of course, is pretty standard. I think that cannot be much, you have to minimize as much as possible. Similarly, finished goods inventory too, that depending on the market demand, you have to have production planning accordingly and pay and stock up. The payables and receivables are the key components actually. This determines on what kind of terms are you negotiating with your supplier, as well as what kind of terms are you giving to your marketing channel. And we will come a little later on the what are the other methods in terms of financing the receivables, etc. But these components this form the working capital. Another important factor would be forecasting foreign exchange rates. We have seen in the last 1 year how the US dollar from $45 went to $55. And so with that has affected tremendously the cost. So how do you plan? How do you project it? I'm sure there are ways, and your bankers can help you also, and taking hedging as definitely one of the options. So you got to determine what kind of a cycle times that are there for payables, receivables, and arrive at what exactly are your working capital needs. Here I want to show you one typical example that we have seen, which I was involved in a plastic component manufacturing industry. If you look at this particular project, typically it goes into land and building, plant and machinery, electrical fitting, etc. Total project cost original estimate is 2.58 crores. But then when we sat down, analyzed what exactly are the requirements, etc., at least we were able to suggest, actually this is a project being set up in a backward area in the border between Kerala and Tamil Nadu. And there was available on industrial estate, and original plan was to build it in certain part. They wanted to buy a land and build a shed. That's how. This is a couple of years old, so the figures may not be very relevant in today's circumstances. But they looked at it, this is what they presented. And but then, however, when we looked at, analyzed, and we decided and told them, they were able to identify a shed, a factory that was closed down in an industrial area, industrial estate, which the industrial estate people were glad to hand over. So hence, straight away land and building cost became zero. It was only they were renting the land and they were renting the shed. When it came to the plant and machinery, as I mentioned earlier, one of the important things for this plastic component was a genset, a generator. Because plastic, this is a continuous process industry, they could not afford power failure, so they required 100% power backup. The leasing of a genset was another option they looked at, and they were able to reduce that particular capital cost by going in for leasing. Other things being the same, one other important thing came up. Being a backward area, they were able to get a government grant, and the government grant was fairly substantial, and they were able to cash out on that. Thereby you could see a 2.58 crore project cost has come down to 1.61 crore, and there been substantial 38% reduction, and the equity from 1 crore is come to only 50 lakhs. So there are a number of ways one can really look at and see how project costs can be reduced, thereby the outlay can be reduced, etc. One can look at. Another example I can give you, a typical one, is the noodles. This was at a place called Srikakulam in Andhra Pradesh. It's a backward district. This particular project cost was 3.05 crores to start with. But two elements that came in that reduced it to 1.4 or 1.5 crores. The two important elements there are, they, instead of putting up a brand new noodles factory, they imported Italian machines, which are second-hand machines. And then they also got 45 lakh government grant, being a backward district. So with the result, the project was generating cash surplus from the year one, because they had no problem in selling. And so straight away from 3 crore to 1.4 or 1.5 crore, the project cost came down. These are the options definitely one must look at when you're setting up an industry, especially a small scale industry. And then next issue, now we have completed on the project cost estimate funding needs. Then we look at what are the cash flow estimates. Then one thing is, these cash flow estimate, you need to be as realistic as possible. That means will you be able to produce or sell all that you produce, or can you first of all produce the quantity that you plan to produce? So be as realistic as possible. You also take into account the time-based demand, and that when I say time-based demand, you must take into account what are the orders, when they're likely to come, and plan accordingly. So you can't say that I'll produce 100% capacity when the market will absorb only that 100% 6 months down the line or 12 months down the line. So there's no point in increasing the capacity just to build up finished goods inventory or flood the marketing channel with products which does not move. And you have to differentiate in the cash flow what is capex, that is capital expenditure, what is operating expenditure. So capital expenditure will go into clearly, when you say cash flow estimate, clearly will become part of the project cost. And operating expenditure will really become part of your working capital needs. And be very conservative in your projections. And whatever revenue as mentioned here should be only on achievable targets. Make sure your procurement is at the right time and right quantities. Where foreign exchange is involved, you need to definitely make sure that you don't compromise or suffer because of foreign exchange losses. When it comes to capital account, then use the best available terms to get the credit. We have seen it already. I'm just repeating the same thing because I want to differentiate between cash flow and capital account. And lease instead of buy, moratorium on term loan, which we have talked about the bank. Make sure your moratorium is such a way that it will only, the repayments start only after you start your production and you have cash flow, cash surplus being generated. And then restrict your credit to a minimum value. When you want to sell, when you want to price your product, and you make sure that how you differentiate your invoicing or pricing. People who want to buy small lots insist on cash down payment. People who buy on larger lots only want the credit. Thereby, you don't unnecessarily have too many transactions. Then cash discount for prepayments. Look at that option. If you people who buy large quantities, like I give an example of AMCs, annual maintenance contract that we generally have. We know instances where some of the machinery manufacturers, let's say you want to tie up a 3-year AMC, it turns out much cheaper than annual AMC multiplied by 3. What are they trying to do? They want to take the cash upfront from you so that they have a cash with them. So that's what they're trying to do. And for you, the advantage would be you're paying, you need anyway, you know very well that you need the 3-year maintenance contract, but you need it, and so but you are able to, by paying upfront, you are having a reduced cost. So that similarly, when you're offering a cash discount for a larger customer or larger payment, you don't mind offering cash discount as long as the cash upfront, you get that. Then other thing, also try to offer value-added services. How you can add value to a service, and something that can you, when you're doing, let's say a pest control person, if you're offering pest control services, then can you also offer something other than pest control? Can you offer something more that anybody is looking for? Maybe for any other mosquito control or any other thing, so that you can add value at a reduced cost. Also, payment methods. If your business permits have a mobile card payment, today you can get mobile. I'm talking to smaller transactions and things like that, where you have a mobile card payment devices available. So those who are instantly willing to pay you, you have, if possible, if that your business permits have a mobile card payment so that you get instant money. There are costs involved. You just have to see what are the costs involved and how much it's worth. And of course, before you're offering a credit, make sure that you do a proper credit check to your credit check of your customers, so that you don't unnecessarily get end up with bad debt or a doubtful debt. So when you look at overall these kind of cash flow, and you kind of map it, that you will see how it follows in a particular project. That you look at it, that cash flow deficit, peak cash flow deficit. Oh, you see on the x-axis the time frame, and the y-axis is the kind of peak cash flow deficit. When you work out on these kind of realistic projections, you will arrive at the peak cash flow deficit somewhere between 2 and 3, let's say 2 and 3 years, or 2 as an example here. And that is actually the funding needs of a particular project. It is not originally made out of plant and machinery plus this and this and this thing. So there is a certain time frame that is involved. So you can even start getting some of this borrowing money at a later stage, so you don't start incurring interest at the early stage itself. So the peak cash flow deficit is determined by the tip of the particular curve that you see there. Very simplistic way we have shown there, but any project can be, you can draw a curve, a similar curve, to determine what exactly, with the peak cash deficit here will determine what actually is the funding needs of the organization. So to sum up, basically, to proper realistic estimates of the project cost and cash flow projections will minimize surprises and panic during implementation. and startup of the project. It will also help in developing a contingency plan. What can you do? I mean, in case something happens, what kind of a standby or plan B do you have? And of course, when whoever you go to with this particular business plan and this kind of financial planning projections built in, they will see it in a very positive way that you have thought of all possible ways and you have planned and planned properly. So that will be your biggest plus point with the creditors and investors.